I see a number of familiar names on this webinar, so hello. I am Monika Henn. I'm a senior manager on the ULI Greenprint team. And for those of you that aren't familiar, ULI is the Urban Land Institute, and we're a real estate focused nonprofit, and we are all about best practices in land use planning and development. And the Greenprint team that I sit on is focused on sustainable real estate and green buildings. And so we do a lot of research on a number of those different topics, and we work with a number of large real estate owners and investors to help improve their environmental performance. So kind of the genesis of a lot of the presentation that I'm going to be providing today is from a report that we put together called Embodied Carbon in Building Materials for Real Estate. So you can access the report here at the short link. We kind of use that as a way to start talking with different experts in the industry to learn, what's the business case for looking at embodied carbon? Why should this be important to real estate? What are some steps to take to get started in this process? And what are some interesting projects on the topic? So if you're interested in that, check out the report. So a little bit of background on embodied carbon. Embodied carbon is kind of refers to the greenhouse gas emissions attributed to manufacturing and transporting construction materials, as well as the process of construction and then building disposal. So, I think in the real estate industry, we talk a lot about how buildings account for around 40% of global emissions, but the building materials and construction side of things, as you can see here, that's around 11% of that total. So it is a sizable amount. And as buildings become more efficient, or as new buildings become more efficient, embodied carbon is going to become a bigger piece of the overall emissions from the building sector. So structural materials are often a really large part of that amount. So things like steel, concrete, synthetic insulation, those really big structural materials are generally the biggest piece of a building's embodied carbon footprint. So, what are some of the market challenges? Obviously, 11% of that total 40%, that's a big piece. Why hasn't the real estate industry necessarily been considering it in the past? So first, when we talk to a lot of experts, the market for low embodied carbon materials, as well as knowledgeable contractors who can really do this work and guide you, is still developing. So people are still across the industry, not just real estate owners, still figuring out, what are their environmental impacts of the products that they're making and how can they be reduced. And then next, so LCAs, that stands for life cycle analyses. They're not available for every product, and accuracy is dependent on incomplete data and difficult to compare set of EPDs, which stands for environmental product declarations. And those basically tell you the environmental footprint of a product. And then they can be collected for a wide range of different materials that you're using in your building. And then a life cycle analysis is really just what is the carbon footprint of the life cycle of a product like that. And then finally, the full value of low embodied carbon projects isn't necessarily understood by all developers, but there's definitely still a business case that we've been able to kind of identify, and more people are seeing that. So I'm going to go into a little bit about, why should you care about embodied carbon? The first one is that regulations are coming. So there are a lot of different regulations kind of assessing embodied carbon. I mean, we've seen in a number of US cities different carbon performance standards, like in New York City, Local Law 97, around how a building operates. But we're starting to see more interest in not just how a building operates, but also, the materials that go into it. What's the footprint, the carbon footprint of those materials? And so Buy Clean California mandates environmental product declarations for materials in state-funded building projects. So that kind of helps to start signal the market that people are going to be looking at that. The Bay Area in California has low carbon concrete codes. Vancouver has some new policies. Internationally, there's also the Netherlands has a circularity goal. And so that kind of plays into embodied carbon as well. And, Denver has another goal as well around net zero energy. So there's a lot of regulations that could be coming to your market. And I think, this isn't a comprehensive list. There are other ones and they're coming out regularly. I think I saw something yesterday about a different policy. So the next piece is green building certifications and reporting structures are really starting to look more at materials. And so, a lot of new buildings, especially in certain markets, they either have to meet LEED standards or it's just kind of a market, not requirement, but it's a standard really to build to something like LEED certification standards. And so each of those green building certifications, they have a materials piece. And, you can get additional points for how close are the materials, or, how short of a distance are they traveling? How local are they? Are you reusing existing materials? Are you reusing the building instead of building a new building? Stuff like that can get you points towards certification. Next, and maybe the most important one for a lot of developers, is that there isn't necessarily an incremental cost for using lower carbon materials, whether that's simply asking for lower carbon concrete options when you put out an RFP, to considering other materials. So this is an example that was provided to us by a developer, kind of showing a comparison between a CLT, so cross-laminated timber and concrete structure, as compared to an all concrete structure. And so if you look at it, you can kind of see at the bottom, the dollar per square foot, it's fairly similar. It's a few dollars more expensive, but it's not including the full kind of financial view, which is that using cross-laminated timber was going to be a faster construction schedule. So they weren't going to have to pay people for as long on site. They weren't going to have to wait for the concrete to cure as much in this project. So, it kind of evened out in terms of how they were looking at it. And so it made sense for them to select the lower embodied carbon choice. Next is interest from communities and different tenants. So, a lot of developers are starting to think about this as more tenants have their own sustainability goals and are looking at how they can have their own positive impact on the environment. And so, I think we've been seeing more and more companies that are leasing space be interested in low embodied carbon buildings, whether that's because they like the look of a mass timber building, because we've heard that, as well as, just setting their own goals around embodied carbon and targets around that front. So getting started, Katie is really going to dive into Microsoft's best practices, but, big picture, some ways for you to get started on this topic of embodied carbon if you have a project in the works. We've identified a few major ideas that you can kind of implement. So the first one is just reusing a building with redevelopment. So, like I said, structural systems can be up to 80% of a building's embodied carbon. If you're reusing a building, then you're cutting a lot of that embodied carbon out. It's a great way to reduce embodied carbon in a project. And, I think we're going to be seeing a lot more focus on redevelopment in the future. The next one is less is more. So be efficient with the materials that you're using when creating a design for a building. So, you can reduce construction waste if you streamline the design process. So you just have fewer materials to get rid of. If you use fewer building materials, you can help improve the indoor air quality, which I'm sure all of you know is increasingly important over the last 2 years and is only going to get more important going forward. So there's fewer materials that way that can be off-gassing, VOCs, and other things, creating a healthier space. And also using fewer building materials just simply saves on material costs. You didn't have to pay for it in the first place. And then finally, there's great placemaking aspect to it. So it capitalizes on the aesthetics of construction materials like mass timber or exposed concrete that can create like a really nice look or really distinct look for an office. And, I think we've seen a lot of tenants be really interested in having a space that looks like that. The circular economy. So kind of circularity is not all about embodied carbon, but it definitely plays a role here. So making sure to reuse materials and minimize minimal material waste. It can lower costs, especially as materials become more expensive, as well as scarcer. And then, we've seen a lot of supply chain issues. So kind of reduces possibilities of that. It creates a new value stream for buildings during deconstruction. We've definitely seen a lot in the Netherlands. They're basically creating these material banks. I think there's one in Houston, maybe one in San Francisco. So there's different material banks when a building is deconstructed where you can go and kind of make new use of those materials, which is really exciting. And then it also ties a building to the local community and creates desirable tenant spaces. We have an example in the report of a space that reuses, I think, the flooring is reused flooring from a local bar that was deconstructed. And so it just creates a really cool story when you're going out to, lease the building up to potential new tenants, or just talk to the community about, really having an impact and tying it in. And then next is ask for it. So, I think the first step for a lot of people that we've worked with in the space around embodied carbon is just to start the conversation with your architectural team, all the stakeholders on a project, saying, we really would love to be low embodied carbon. We want to think about this. So how can you be a part of that, whether it's through design, whether it's through the materials that you're selecting? Starting the process early and asking for it is the best way as well to make sure that it's the lowest upfront cost. So that can be requesting EPDs, including requirements for EPDs in RFPs that you put out there, and then just looking for design opportunities to reduce or replace the highest embodied carbon materials. Making sure, especially in a new development, to calculate the impact or the potential impact that different design choices can make. There's a lot of different tools out there, and there can be a lot of interplay in terms of, how to calculate the best outcome. But just kind of setting the benchmark of, what does a typical building for us look like in terms of embodied carbon, and then how can we kind of iterate and improve on that is really important. And then finally, in the report, we just have this simple pathway to kind of think about reducing embodied carbon in a development. So definitely encourage you to check out the report and just think through how the work that you're doing can be a part of that.